Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight, we're going to examine two types of forces, centripetal and centrifugal forces. We'll be discussing what they are, lots of examples, and why they're important. So let's get started. So let's begin with centripetal forces. These are forces tending to bind together the citizens of a state, thus promoting its unity. So these unify or stabilize, strengthen, bind together, foster solidarity, or promote cohesion. I always like to remember this as petals on a flower. The petals are all bound together at the center of the flower. So there's something holding it together. And centripetal forces can lead to greater cultural cohesion, national unity, and solidarity. And this can work across different scales. Coronado has centripetal forces that hold our school together. Las Vegas has centripetal forces that hold our city together. Nevada has centripetal forces that bring our state together. And the United States has centripetal forces that unify us as a country. Centrifugal forces, or centrifugal forces, on the other hand, are forces that tend to divide a country, threatening the unity of a state. So it leads to devolution, it disrupts order, destabilizes, or weakens the bonds that bind us together. I always remember this because years ago, I had asked my students, how are you going to remember the difference between centripetal and centrifugal forces? They sound very similar, but mean the exact opposite. So we need to make sure that we don't get them confused. And this one girl raised her hand. She hadn't said anything all year. I got super excited. I called on her, and she said, completely straight-faced, centrifugal has the letters FU in it. And if somebody told me F you, I wouldn't want to be around them anymore. It was the first thing she said all year. So I kind of stared at her for a minute, then told her she was a genius. I don't know that it's the most appropriate way to remember it, but my kids always seem to get this pretty well. So I'm for it. So anything that disrupts internal order, threatens cohesion, or encourages the breakup of a territory is called a centrifugal force. So now that we know the definitions, let's look at some examples, shall we? So this is going to kind of be like a fizz, but for most of our slides, I want you to guess if the example is a centripetal or centrifugal force. But then I want you to add some explanation as to why you think that. Think of this as our claim and explain. Your claim is centripetal or centrifugal. And then I want you to explain your answer. Here we go. In Thailand, 94.6% of the population practices Buddhism or religion. So is Buddhism a centripetal or unifying force? Or is it a centrifugal or divisive force? Dora's going to run a little slower today, give you a chance to write down that explanation. In some countries, a state religion or really dominant religion can be a unifying force. So Buddhism would be a unifying force in Thailand, as is Hinduism in Nepal, Judaism in Israel, or Islam in Pakistan. Japan has a single official language and a population that is 97.9% ethnically Japanese. So is that centripetal or centrifugal? Japan is what we will define as a nation state, In a country like Japan, cultural cohesion is easier to attain than in most other countries, which are home to maybe more than one ethnic group. Ethnicity can bind a country together, although ethnicity is typically bound with other aspects of culture, such as language, as it is in Japan, or religion. In Belgium, there are two major languages that are spoken. Would this be a unifying centripetal force or a divisive centrifugal force? The people of Belgium are divided over language. As you can see, the two different regions of the country are geographically divided, and it's largely based on language. The groups coexist somewhat peacefully, but that isn't always the case. A country could actually break apart because of these divisions, whether it's peacefully, as we saw with the Czech Republic or Czechia and Slovakia, or as we'll see later, it could break apart violently. Ultimately, cultural diversity within a country's population can often serve as a centrifugal force. This is the U.S. women's national soccer team. So, would a national sports team be a centripetal force or a centrifugal force? National sports teams, like during the World Cup or the Olympics, can often unite a country's population. Next up, we have Yugoslavia. This country had ethnic, religious, and linguistic differences. So is that diversity more likely to be a centripetal force that unifies the country, or a centrifugal force that divides it? In the case of Yugoslavia, when a majority ethnic group controls the state, as the Serbs did, minority ethnic groups can be economically, politically, and culturally marginalized, producing very strong centrifugal forces. In fact, Yugoslavia broke up violently and largely fragmented along those religious, ethnic, and linguistic lines. Next up, we have a quote. The quote is, "Education in my family was not merely emphasized, it was a raison d'etre," from Stephen Chu. The quote references the raison d'etre, or reason for being. So Stephen Chu is saying that for his family, education was their reason for being. So would that be a centripetal force unifying his family, or a centrifugal force dividing it? The raison d'etre has been argued by some political geographers as the most significant centripetal force. It must be something that draws people to see members of a country as their in-group. So Stephen Chu sees his family as his in-group because they share the same reason for being. To apply this above the family scale, the raison d'etre for Pakistan was to create a Muslim majority state in South Asia. The raison d'etre for Israel was to create a homeland for the Jews. These reasons for being are incredibly strong unifying forces for the people within that group. Yemen is a country that is in the midst of a civil war. So would a civil war be a centripetal force that brings people together, or a centrifugal force that pulls people apart? Yemen is the most fragile state as of 2019, as a result of its civil war, which pits the Iran-backed Houthi movement against Yemen's Saudi-backed government. It's important to understand there are religious differences present in this conflict. Iran is the world's largest Shia Muslim country, Shia being a smaller branch of Islam, and only about 35% of the population of Yemen. The Saudis are backing a pro-government group that is supporting the Sunni Muslim government. Sunnis are a larger branch of Islam and represent about 65% of Yemen's population. And while religious differences are worth knowing, the causes of this civil war go beyond that and include extreme poverty, unemployment, water shortages, food insecurity, and corruption. In fact, according to the United Nations, 50,000 Yemeni have died as a result of an ongoing famine due to this war. This is a photo of school children saying the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States. Is this an example of a centripetal force or a centrifugal force? Common values and ideals can serve to tie people together as a nation, despite other cultural differences. The United States has been able to absorb people from all around the world, different ethnicities, languages, and religions, and help people identify as Americans. This is based on a common belief in ideas such as democracy and individual rights and freedoms. Next up, we have the Underground, which is an efficient subway system in London, capital of the United Kingdom. So does this unify people or divide people? Transportation systems today promote interaction between areas, joining them economically and socially, and thereby unifying people. These infrastructure improvements can be high-cost investments, such as airports or interstate highways or the subway system that we see here. But they are vital to a country's economic and social development. Those same high-cost investments might benefit one region, as with London that we see here, more than others, which actually can lead to conflict. Improvements to communication systems can have the same effect. They're generally seen as something that promotes interaction between places and unifies people who might be geographically distant. But it can also bring in ideas that clash with the values of a particular country. So some countries, like China, have state-run media organizations that attempt to present a common message, thereby diminishing ideas that might pull their country apart. Let's start with what type of map are we looking at? And what is our scale of analysis? What we see here is the subnational distribution of poverty in Indian states using a choropleth map. So, are poverty rates that vary considerably within a country a unifying force or a dividing force? Economic disparities within a country's population can have a centrifugal effect. Uneven development within a country may lead to divisions between the haves and the have-nots. India is an emerging economic power, but it's not a strongly unified country. India has seen rapid economic growth on the global scale, but there are areas of the country and within cities where wealthy citizens have access to better transportation options, better and safer housing, and safer public spaces. These wealthy areas are surrounded by walls and gates, creating enclaves of wealth that are adjacent to slums with rising crime and deep, extreme poverty. This is the Queen of England. Would she, or other royalty from around the world, serve to bring people together or pull people apart? Royalty is typically a strong unifying symbol in many countries, such as Sweden, Japan, Thailand, and the United Kingdom. And royals are an example of iconography, which is a person or item that is symbolically important, or an icon. And iconography, like royals, can be especially important in countries that have diverse populations, as the United Kingdom does. Next, we have a data table looking at Mexico's most populous cities. Notice Mexico City. Would an especially large, powerful, influential city be a unifying force for a country, or something that would pull it apart? We call these cities primate cities because they are the first rank or most influential cities within a country. Mexico City is the political capital, the economic center, and the cultural hub of the country, and dominates with population as well. This connects many people of the country with this one city, thereby making it a unifying force. This is the territory of Nunavut, which was created for the Inuit people. So the decision to create a subnational territory for an indigenous population, is that a centripetal force or a centrifugal force? Rather than see the country potentially break apart, Canada decided to grant the Inuit greater authority to make their own decisions so that they can align with their traditional values. So the creation of Nunavut was a centripetal force at multiple scales. It was a unifying force for the Inuit people, who got to have a greater say in their territory, but it also strengthens the bonds between the territory of Nunavut and the whole of Canada. Now let's take a look at another example of ethnicity and its role on the stability of a country. The Catalan region of eastern Spain has desired independence for a long time. The Catalan independence movement is an example of ethno-regionalism. Ethno-regionalism occurs when a minority group, like the Catalans, are concentrated in a particular region of a country, as they are in eastern Spain, where Barcelona is located. So, is the ethno-regionalism of Catalonia an example of a centripetal force or a centrifugal force? As you may have been noticing on several of the last few slides, it very much depends. It depends if you're looking at this issue from the viewpoint of the Catalans or Spain as a whole. Catalonian independence is a strong unifying force for the Catalan people, but it is divisive from the entirety of Spain. But Spain has been able to keep the rest of Catalonia, as well as the Basque region of northern Spain, within its control by allowing autonomous regions to run their own regional governments. So Catalonia has decision-making authority over things like police, education, health systems, environmental regulations, the ability to tax, as well as the protection of regional languages. To a certain degree, that has been successful in keeping Spain together, but the Catalan people still very much desire independence. So forces that unify people are centripetal, and the forces that divide them are centrifugal. But many political geographers have argued that this is too simplistic and that we cannot identify a given event or process and simply define it as unifying or divisive. So what ultimately determines if something is unifying or divisive? It often depends on one's perspective and the argument that you make. There was a reason why I wanted you to provide evidence and explanation tonight, not just identify it as centripetal or centrifugal. And it may even change over time. For example, the 1989 reunification of Germany between East and West Germany was widely perceived as a powerful centripetal force when it happened. However, the challenges of bridging the social divide between East and West Germans and the economic divisions have contributed to a greater awareness of the centrifugal forces associated with reunification. So to finish up tonight, here is an example from India that has its roots in an FRQ from 2006. Depending on the situation, for example, religion might be a centripetal force in one instance, as Hinduism is throughout much of India, but it's also one of the largest Muslim countries on earth, which could be highly divisive for people within India. The same can be said for language, immigration, election results, or national identity. And it's true that large countries are more difficult to integrate with transportation and communication systems. But it can also be difficult for elongated or narrow states or fragmented countries to have very similar problems. The biggest takeaway from this lesson is that often an action has potential to be both types of force at once. It's on you to try and figure out, based on the context and the evidence provided, if it would tend towards uniting people and be a centripetal force, or if it would tend to divide people and thus be a centrifugal force. We're going to get some additional practice in this nuance when we come back to class. Have a good evening, everyone. I'll see you later.